The beginning of the
recording has started.
Hello, people. Sorry, you didn't miss the introduction. It was really nice. And we'll find yours. So you are that one, yeah? No, you're that one.
That one, yeah.
And F5, everyone? Yeah, there you go. So you can either just press that or the keys.
The arrow.
Yeah, or the enter key.
Which one?
Just the enter key will take you through. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm just here.
Jan, thank you so much. It's an absolute delight to be here and quite surprising. Matt and I, we've worked together for quite some time and we have quite a lovely relationship in terms of the way that we work and share knowledge and worry and get excited and get nervous and sometimes get surprised by what comes out of our mouths. Just in kickstarting today, I want to give a bit of a context around where Indigenous STEM sits at the moment, what the developments and all of those things that really have impacted on the place that we are at today. It's an interesting journey. And then I'll hand over to Matt, who will talk about what is actually happening on the ground around the country. In doing that, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal country today. My heritage is Manajali, Yikambeh Nation, and that's southeast, in the area that we now refer to as southeast Queensland. Whenever I come to somebody else's country, it's always about getting those permissions to actually to work, to get the invitation. And you had that beautiful welcome yesterday from Uncle, I believe. That's what empowers us and gives us the permission to respectfully work together as a community. Now I'm going to start driving the technology, and I'm not that good at it, and I'm not that good at PowerPoints because I guess even though Matt and I work between both worlds, the way that we work and think is often quite different, and I'll speak about that a little bit later. But we like TR. Our ancestors sit behind us. And really it's often that process of reflection on our histories and having that support behind us that gives us the shape of the conversations that we have. So a PowerPoint gives me a framework and sort of limits me to what I'm going to say. So the ancestors, please, be with us through this funny little journey. So Indigenous STEM, what we're talking about, I guess, is Indigenous knowledge systems that through our history have enabled thousands and thousands and thousands of years and thousands of generations to actually live peacefully and healthily and resiliently on country. Part of that process is also about listening, and not just listening with the ears and not just seeing with the eyes. It's all about connecting to country, being watchful, and analysing that to come into a place and a practice and a process that drives us forward in a safe way. Dandiri, deep listening. So, 4 millennia we were here and things were looking pretty good. And then we encountered a new way of thinking that wasn't necessarily our own. In the first 3 years of settlement, 50% of the population of the Sydney Basin died through disease. Fortunately, part of that settlement process was about anthropologists documenting our practices. Fortunately, we have access to that in our library systems that have helped us examine and explore that we didn't lose. We didn't lose it. It's not lost practice. We weren't careless. We didn't leave it under the tree. It was cultural practice that was taken from us. So now we're working desperately to look at ways that we can reclaim that culture, reclaim that knowledge. And we sit now in a cultural landscape that is about recognition, reconciliation, respect, relationship, and opportunity. When we talk about reconciliation, please always remember it's not about placing guilt, placing blame. It's a process of making good so that we can all move forward together. So what the priorities for us as a community, and I, speak very humbly about that role, or take my role very humbly in that positioning. Key focuses for us, I believe, and from what I've seen, are about that reclamation of culture and heritage, about the validation of that knowledge, about the ways that we can continue our practices of intergenerational transmission of knowledge, how we continue that connectedness to those practices and ensure that they continue to develop, and how we build a community of practice. With the process of settlement and colonisation was a really strong separation of culture, a divided community that we still see as, and we still work in isolation. What we're trying to do is bring that knowledge together in one place so that we can actually share as a community of nations those knowledges and get the strength from that. Now, the beautiful Jonathan Jones, the Wiradjuri artist who was responsible for the last Kaldor public art project, there was a mapping of the garden palace that burnt in 1880, and an enormous amount of our material, cultural material, was lost in that fire. Jonathan did a fantastic mapping of that space across the botanical gardens here, up to the State Library, out of shields made of kaolin. It was incredibly impressive, and in his essay, he wrote this. It's a really lovely way of, I guess, consolidating all those conversations that we have around the table about what is the difference. And I won't read it to you. You can do that. But it is about different ways of working, not working in silos. When we come together, we always talk about an integrated approach. We can't, sort of separate the sciences from the arts at all, because they're totally interrelated and totally the way that we think and work. So what we did was, in my role at the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, we tried to bring together a cohort of scientists, educators, artists, philosophers, thinkers, explorers together to talk about this thing called Indigenous science or Indigenous knowledge. And from that symposium, this was really the key considerations that emerged. That thing of cultural consolidation, of ownership of the knowledge, permission to use that knowledge, inclusion in the process of using that knowledge, and acknowledgement of the source of the knowledge. At that symposium, we had a series of keynotes. We had beautiful Bruce Pascoe, who's doing amazing work in the research field of investigation, looking at those anthropological records, but also looking and listening to the evidence on country. Kalisha Morris is a young one who's looking at environmental land management. Dwayne has been facilitating the Aboriginal Astronomy Research Project. He's now based at Monash. And David Beaumont is from the City of Sydney and is looking at what Indigenous science looks like in an urban environment. Angie Abdullah, a wonderful woman who sits on the UN Permanent Committee on Indigenous Issues, was looking at robotics and Indigenous knowledge systems and coding, how that all comes together. And Joanne and Subra from Macquarie have been looking after a thing called NICEP, the National Indigenous Science Education Program, that's about young people getting the opportunity to play with the sciences. But rather than it being just a straight symposium, everything was interspersed with these series of yarn-ups so that everybody in the room had the opportunity to contribute to the conversation and share their knowledges. They were the kinds of issues that we were looking at about country, but a lot of it was about reclamation. From our plenary, there were a series of issues raised. And I'll just quickly skim through these. And I think one of the things that you will see through this is it's about the use of the knowledge, about who owns the knowledge. And in a climate where today, this year, we're celebrating the point when the Australian community 50 years ago came together to vote at a referendum. And there were two questions posed in that referendum. One was to increase the number of representatives in the Senate, and the other was to include Aboriginal people in the counting of the census and the inclusion in the population of Australia. Interesting kind of concept that when I was 9, I wasn't a member of the Australian population. So that's why things like ownership of knowledge and our use of it is really critically important to that healing process of reconciliation. What we do see is a lot of non-Indigenous academics working with that knowledge, consolidating it and sharing it, but sometimes we as a community wonder where the benefit is back to us. So as part of that process, and in dealing with that, what we at the museum have embarked upon is the process of the development of a protocol, not a policy, a protocol, a living process that deals with that issue of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, how we use it, how it moves, and how we develop those respectful relationships. So I'll just briefly run through some of these points. It is about community ownership. It's absolutely about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people being the undisputed experts on their culture. It's a battle that we have to face, and it's a difficult battle. But it's also about how we can connect that knowledge and the sharing of that knowledge with our communities and how we can keep moving our practices forward. So within our guidelines, in the protocol, there are 10 core principles that are about consultation, about timely consultation, free and prior informed consent, and the recognition of ongoing rights and the opportunity to benefit from those rights and ownership is critical. So that's what the kind of world that Matt and I live in and try and negotiate when we work with Microsoft or we work with the CSIRO, who are doing amazing things in the area of Indigenous STEM. They have an enormous project funded by BHP Bulletin. I think it's about $3 million. And that's not just about the technique or the scientific knowledges. It's also about how we share and inspire our next generations to take up that mantle, to take ownership of that knowledge and to move forward. So that sort of gives you a sense of what the landscape is like, what the country we deal with is like. Good. So I will hand over to the young one to talk about the sexy, exciting things that we do. But just before I do, I'd like to close with this statement that sits on the memorial to my family. And for me, it's the way I live. And for us who are dealing with knowledge and knowledge transmission and science and arts and culture, the notion that we are only here for a short time and what we do has a huge impact on our future for our next generations is incredibly profound. So thank you. I'll be around for question time, but Maddie, so do you. Taking the water.
Yeah, take your water.
Thank you, Marcus, for that great introduction, and thank you, Jan, and all the organisers for inviting us across today. I'd also like to pay acknowledgement to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Gadigal is a really interesting word. Gadi comes from the name for the grass tree, the species of Xanthorrhea. It's a local Sydney name, and that plant itself used to be really dominant along the foreshores around Sydney Harbour and stuff, but it's also a plant that has incredible technological knowledges embedded in it. The giant stem that grows out of Xanthorrhea was used in spear-making shafts, and the resin that exudes out of the bottom of the plant as well is a really incredible technology that was used in a type of plastic for all around the country in different sorts of ways as well. Yeah, I work at the Macleay Museum, so we're a bit smaller museum, a university museum. We have a chance to sort of share across all the different faculties some great technologies and ideas and meet some wonderful people who have incredible experiences that they could bring to the old cultural anthropology collections, which we have, as well as our natural history collections. But as Marcus was so eloquently pointing out, 90% of the work involved in applying a new technology to Indigenous knowledge or to Indigenous museum objects is about the policies and protocols and setting up a safe cultural space for the owners of the intellectual properties in those materials to actually have the moral authority over how that information is shared, over how that information is distributed, not the least of which is who gets the chance to economically prosper from the application of these Indigenous knowledges, which can be embedded and locked in plants or cultural artefacts and different things like that, how they're interpreted, who gets to publish it, who gets to own it, name it and say it. Working at a primarily natural history museum, we have a lot of really great initiatives that have sort of come out in the which we've really tried to apply. So one of the first things that we're working on, I'll get to it a bit later, we're actually in a bit of a transition zone, our museum. Just to give you a bit of a backstory, the Macleay Museum was set up by 3 generations of the Macleay family before it was bequested to the University of Sydney in 1891. So it's quite an old collection. It's actually the private collection of the founder of the Australian Museum. So he was president also of the Linnaean Society of New South Wales, and there's this incredible archive of information of those early natural history collectors who very often used Aboriginal guides in collecting natural history specimens. It was their intellectual property about the seasonal patterns of birds or reptiles or those specimens that they were collecting for museums all around the world. A lot of that is unattributed. So one of the first things we try and do is at least give, they might be specimens or objects, we try and name them in the language of the people who made them. The first name that we try and use is the name that someone from that community who speaks that language may be able to see. And so you just can't underestimate how important language reclamation is, and thankfully there's the good and the bad collectors throughout history as well. So awesome collectors like John Gould would record the Aboriginal word for a particular, in this case, bird that he was collecting. And for modern students, if you're going to learn this Latin name for a word, you may as well learn the Aboriginal word as well. It's not that difficult, actually. And it embeds all these different layers of information, which is useful for scientists or artists or all sorts of different people, actually. The words can be really poetically descriptive. They can actually be seasonal and environmental knowledges embedded in the pronunciation of different type of words. So being able to to reclassify a sense and get a glimpse. I mean, for Aboriginal people, the whole land was an encyclopedia. There's certain trees, it's a library and an archive of all sorts of information can be associated with the most ordinary looking plant or stone or rock or different sort of geographic landmark. So being able to get a glimpse of that incredible landscape, which was built and named by Aboriginal people over tens of thousands of years, is one of the jobs. And I'm sure, as you know, as librarians and archivists yourself, trying to put something non-tangible like that into a category and classify it, you can lose a lot of the meaning that it has for Aboriginal people. So hopefully there's interesting ways that we can tap into that vast resource, which is an incredible, story of 60,000 years of survival of men, women and children moving these massive intergenerational migrations across the country of sustainably living of, from 25 to 15,000 years ago, Aboriginal people survived an ice age that was in Australia. I mean, it's really valuable information as we face our own issues with the climate moving into the future and different things like that. There's just no shortage of important information embedded in the way that we engage with Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous philosophies, and the technologies that are available now are actually providing some really interesting ways that we can hopefully do that and hopefully move forward ethically. It's also just amazing to you've really got to try and let go of so much when you're approaching Indigenous knowledges and philosophies. I work with Professor Jackie Troy, who's a linguist, and she taught us how you've got to forget the cardinal compass, the northeast, southwest, which was imposed on the landscape. When you study Indigenous languages, you'll find 8, 9, 10 different directions, words for it, and a completely different way of navigating the landscape, which are experience-based of moving through that landscape. And they're just incredible ways to actually open up the landscapes that we walk across today and to get an understanding. Like in the Sydney region, you have this northwest and southeast sort of winds based on whether the wind's coming from the mountains or the coast and the smells that it brings. It's just a really fascinating way to actually see that something really ordinary like wind directions, which we take for granted, can actually have an entire Indigenous philosophy embedded underneath them, which is much more based on an experience-based learning. So a lot of what we do is just reconstructing historical assemblages. Probably one of the best examples is our bark paintings, which were acquired around 1946. They were acquired by Berndt, the anthropologist, and classified into all the anthropological typologies and different things. Yet when we work with community members from these, this is from the Yirrkala community today, they reconstruct these paintings in the most incredible new assemblages and pull out all these thematic elements to this block of information, which is, for us, 100% more valuable than us trying to put the old boring museum classifications of, looking at the different patterns and the different techniques and different things to paintings that we would never put next to each other in a curatorial museum sense. A community member will put them together and read it in a way which tells a vast story about the connections between two different clan groups. When you can just assemble the information in ways that Aboriginal people can reconstruct it, I find that's a great way to actually do community consultations and different things like that. You know, as working in museums or libraries and places like that, you can digitize it up to a point, but you also need to be able to let go at a certain point too and be receptive to what's going to come back, because that's going to be just as an important version of that information as, you know, the official version, which you might need to use with your own systems. So a lot of the work that we did came out of doing a similar project I did a couple of years ago, which was looking at our stone tool collection. You'll find Aboriginal stone tools in every museum around the world. There's estimates, there's about 150,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander objects held in museums all around the world, and nearly 100,000 of them are stone tools. These incredible assemblages that were sent from Sydney Uni, for example, and swapped with museums all around the world, we're still piecing together this incredible network of scholars who are so fascinated in the technology of Aboriginal people. We sort of forget that there's a real craftsmanship that goes into stone tools. It's not just randomly picking up any old rock and banging it to make an edge. There's specific knowledges and protocols embedded in where you source particular stone materials. And, there's teaching involved in the production of the tools. When some archaeology sites are done properly, you can actually see a spot where a teacher is making his tools and his students are sitting around him based on the debris that's left there. So, thanks to new technologies, we can do a lot less invasive things like archaeology, which, can tell us so much more about the specific places that people were living in. So you'd use a ground penetrating radar these days to do a survey of a site. There's no thing stopping you from actually 3D printing the stuff that turns up on the radar. It's really exciting the ways that you might be able to non-invasively ask these really important questions about particular landscapes and be able to uncover ways of actually representing the data that you find in that. But then also, how do you store that digital data in a culturally appropriate ways too? It needs to be levels of access in terms of permissions of who can actually access it at different times. So what we did with this show was basically take all the tools out of their archaeology classifications and group them by language region. And when you did that, you got this whole different picture of the toolbox of a particular landscape in Australia. This one's from Tasmania, for example. And when you look at the tools individually, you don't really see that much. But when you see them together, you see this vast network of source materials that they're using to make these, which is a really important information for a community such as the Tasmanian community, which was so violently hit by dispossession. And so many of their trade routes, their knowledges about seasons and where people lived and different sort of things were so violently taken from them. If it's at all possible to reconstruct some of these assemblages of historical data, it might be photos, it might be stone tools, it might be information in the Land Society reports, for example. you just get better outcomes, as I guess what I'm trying to work. And for us, that turned into a really great project that turned into all sorts of different ways. We were studying the different type of ochres. And what we're really trying to do is get younger Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students into archaeology, into materials science, into aerodynamics, into all these different sort of things by getting them to understand that the knowledges that are embedded in cultural artifacts in ochre production, for example, can take you into all sorts of fields. I think I'll show that in another example I'll come to later. But so we have really early bark paintings in our collection. This was acquired in 1875. It's one of the oldest in Australia, in an Australian museum. And we had researchers from Harvard who were really interested in the binders between the bark and the ochres that were painted on the surface. So we were able to help put together a community consultation project where young people were engaged with these, incredible scientists from Harvard who run the big pigment library over there at the, sorry, I still blank the actual name of the institution, but at the Harvard University Art Museums that were really incredible. And one of the things that they were interested in was how to preserve barks way into the future, because most of these weren't made to last 100 years. Let alone 200 or 300. But it turned out that the similar types of technologies that you're using to analyse pigments and binders is exactly the same technology that they're using on the Mars rover, for example, to do soil samples. And so through getting kids learning about how pigments attach to bark paintings and different things like that, we're actually able to expose them to this huge field of science where their community access is a huge bonus, and their opportunities to do study and hopefully get jobs in these new types of industries, which on the one hand are some of the most advanced technologies in the world. I mean, doing soil samples on Mars, and also some of the most closest to home in terms of preserving and conserving our bark paintings into the future. So when you're using exactly the same technology, but being able to see it used at home as well as, incredible stuff in the reaches of space. I think that's how we can sort of get our younger generations moving into these science fields. Being able to, as broadly as possible, show just how incredible that, what incredible opportunities are out there actually in terms of knowledge and preservation of knowledge and learning. So another really great one that came out of that was we're really interested in 3D printing technology. And so we had an artist came in who did some amazing work using, trying to visualize. I mean, most people, when they hear climate change, they're seeing all these data and maps and things like that, but that's not the way that everybody learns. So she was actually making models of the type of data to show the rises in water temperature in Sydney Harbour, for example, or different things like that. And it was a really great way to represent data that most people wouldn't sort of see. And when you see the spikes and things like that in some of these, it is just a different way of engaging a completely new type of audience. But the really interesting thing that came out of that was the idea that instead of using petrochemical-based plastics in 3D printers, we should be looking more towards sustainable sources like spinifex resin, for example, or xanthoria resin, which you get from the gaddy tree. It's a type of plastic, basically. It's been used for thousands of years. It's malleable. You heat it, you reuse it, you heat it again. And the architecture faculty who we're working with were really interested in how do we use these natural resins in making 3D printer filaments. And the funny thing is, these were questions that were being asked 100 years ago in the Powerhouse, in the Mars Museum, for example. There's in the late 19th century, lots of people were looking at resins and essentially oils and all the botanical economic botany knowledges that were embedded in Australian plants. And there's some incredible research that's already been done. So in a way, we don't really need to reinvent the wheel. It's about a better appreciation of this historical information, which is embedded in these incredible collections like Mars and the Maclay, and just finding these incredible associations of how we can apply these ancient technologies into incredibly new applications, which are more sustainable and more culturally appropriate. Alan Merritt at the University of Queensland did some great work in applying this type of technology, but it hit a barrier because there were some nanoscientists who saw how amazing spinifex resin was at the molecular level, and so they tried to turn it into a type of Kevlar. And they sort of rushed ahead because they were just working in the lab. They understood these sort of things. But when the community custodians who still own 50% of the application of the intellectual property of spinifex resin found out that it might be being used for military applications, they were really wary about that. So it does sort of show just because you can, find or use a material that you find in a database, it doesn't mean that there aren't cultural protocols about the way that that information is applied. So they went back to the drawing board. From what I know, they may have started again. I mean, when they I don't know how nanoscientists work, but when they reapplied that technology into the type of new generation plastics that they were making, they did make some awesome finds. So maybe there's better applications for that in housing in remote communities or things like that. So that's what a lot of those protocols sort of mean. It's about, well, no, how do we actually, it's great that you can do this technology and find some new type of Kevlar, but, then it's a simple question. It's what's in it for us? Why, once again, there's been so much that has been appropriated from Aboriginal knowledges that modern institutions don't have the legal grounds to say that we didn't know. It's not just the land that was dispossessed from Aboriginal people. It was so many different knowledges, medicinal knowledges, but food knowledges associated with plants. There was already been cases of a cosmetic company which tried to patent a knowledge associated with the Kakadu plum and use it in commercial applications all around the world. But once you patent that knowledge, that locks out all the Aboriginal use knowledges of that particular Kakadu plum as well. So it's amazing how some of the oldest knowledges in the world are coming up against some of the newest technological applications in the world and finding a place in them. But once again, a lot of Aboriginal people are not seeing the benefits of how those applications may work. And just from a purely museological sense, there is really great applications of how we can bring old objects to new life. So, for example, we have boomerangs from, say, the 1840s, which you'd never dream of going out into the open and throwing. But you can 3D print that to the most precise details, even to the exact weight of the original, and make models of that, which we can actually test the aerodynamic properties of different sort of boomerangs and compare them with other boomerangs from the very earliest stage of the collection. The example on the left is when the plans for a wrench that was needed on the International Space Station were actually emailed to the station. So museum objects can purely exist as data these days, and we don't have a lot of protocols in place as how that data is actually preserved, accessed, used, commercialized. Sometimes when things move into that purely digital realm, we sort of forget that there's very real-world applications. I mean, we've all seen how people can yank images of historic photos off museum websites and print them on coffee cups and sell them on eBay and things like that. It's not just Indigenous knowledges that need preserving. There's all sorts of examples of how these protections, which we learn from working with Indigenous communities, can be applied to different collections as well. I guess lastly, the really great one that we've done some workshops with through IndigiLab, which is this organisation Marcus and I work with, which is sort of an inter-institutional organisation. We work with media companies, museums and things. It's more of just a project space where we can sort of apply. So one of the things one of our colleagues is doing is working with national parks to use 3D drones and 3D cameras to map particular places where we can have Aboriginal guides telling their stories of these particular locations, making them sort of accessible in ways that don't, need thousands of visitors to maintain the level of funding that they need to keep them open. Not to mention the incredible environmental applications, which Indigenous communities are at the forefront in terms of drone technology. You might have seen the story just this week of it had been announced for a while, but it's almost hopefully not, but 1,000 kilometres of coastline of mangroves which have dried out because of the seasonal change up there. In the Torres Strait, they use drones to spot fishing nets that have been cut adrift, and they've caused those massive environmental damage to marine life along the coast. But one of the really fascinating things of that application would be to work with elders and to use the drone technology to map the connections between the different storylines all around the country, to map this different version of the landscape. When you work with elders who are prepared to share public versions of their knowledge and information, you get this incredible picture of the land that we live, which is so important to preserve. We do it really well through visual arts these days. Some of the most incredible storylines that you see where people are attaching their paintings to, but purely from a data level, we can somehow preserve elders' knowledges of the journeys between different locations and different sort of things. I've seen some okay applications of this technology. I mean, there's no reason we couldn't have a drone being operated in Central Australia right now and an elder sitting right here telling us to go left or to turn right, recording that in a digital format, which in 500 years' time, some future generation of that person can sit there and see how these elders view the landscape and preserve that connection to country. That's where you can see some really exciting applications of modern technologies to preserving ancient knowledges. And it's hard enough even getting a good phone signal in a lot of these cases. So, we are talking pie in the sky stuff really, but we shouldn't be. If the technology is here already and we have the community willing to do these sorts of things, these are exactly the type of projects that we should be really using our resources and libraries and archives. I mean, at every data point along the way, you can attach, it might be photos, it might be diaries, it might be all sorts of information, which it just builds to the map of Australia and the Encyclopedia of Australia, which we all use to navigate the world. Monitoring bushfires, even in preserving ancient fire making techniques and different things like that. It is often the case that new technologies are really well suited to remote Australia. Mobile phones have been a real game changer in a lot of communities in terms of actually making communication between people a lot easier than it used to be. And that's just another bit, and interestingly, I mean, we have 10,000-year-old, the oldest boomerangs found in Australia were 10,000 years old in South Australia. And this proposed new drone for Mars, the next one that takes off in 2020, is using exactly the same aerodynamic knowledges that we used in the product. They tested all the different shapes that they could have used for this drone, and the one that they settled on was a boomerang shape. So, apart from that big USA stamped on the side, it is, this is why we need to encourage so many more of our younger guys to really broaden what they understand the cultural application of knowledge is, because, there's always an important role for elders guiding people and setting them, but there's also so many great opportunities for younger people to use the knowledge that they do have in completely different applications. Schools can log in to the Mars Museum, and there's a Mars rover simulation track, and so they can drive, get some training driving a Mars rover around a physical location in the Museum of Arts and Applied Sciences Museum, but they can be sitting in the school in Griffith or Brewarrina or something like that. Being able to use our institutional, resources and really open them up into some of the more remote communities, I think is going to be where to see some, who knows, with more exciting sort of opportunities that we can actually develop further into that. Getting pretty close to time, so I thought I'd just finish. So the museum was very fortunate to receive a significant bequest, and so we actually closed after 130 years. And, we were an older 19th century model museum, so we had our natural history, our cultural anthropology. Hopefully in 2019, the new museum that we're just starting work on now will be open, and it's going to be a really great opportunity for us as a museum to actually take our, it's almost looking like we're taking our collections from the 19th into the 21st century and sort of forgetting the 20th. So hopefully there's just some really amazing ways that we can still preserve the historical collections and the history of what they are, but really turn them into information that's readable on all sorts of level for all sorts of audiences. It might be scientists, it might be community, it might be audiences that we've never thought of at all. So that's one of the ways that we're sort of using our historical collections, but are trying to apply new technologies to turn them into new ways of thinking about those collections. I think I might leave it there.
Thank you, Marcus and Matt. What a great presentation, and so many things for us to think about, really, with Marcus giving us the big picture and the overall, and then Matt giving us so many really exciting examples and, made you think about so many things. We have a few minutes for questions. Do we have any from the audience? Everyone too overwhelmed?
It's amazing stuff.
It is amazing stuff. Yeah. Well, Matt and Marcus will be with us for morning tea, and so I would encourage you to grab them and to talk to them. I'm just, just even things like the 3D printing. It's so bloody obvious. And I'm just loving the idea of being the work done around the climate change with those images, and yeah, just brilliant. And isn't it interesting that our keynote speaker yesterday morning, Carolyn McGregor, was equating working with young people and astronauts, and then we've got the world's oldest culture and that connection again today, and what a way to get young people to understand sciences. So Matt and Marcus, thank you. A little gift from us here. Please join. And you will have seen us handing out black envelopes to our speakers. And I always wonder what the speakers are getting as a gift, Is it a David Jones gift voucher? It's obviously not chocolates because it's in an envelope. Now, I know that this is going to take away the surprise for those people who are still to get one, but I'll tell you what we have given all our speakers. We've made a donation on behalf of all our speakers to the Indigenous Literacy Fund. And so that's in their names. And so that's what's inside the envelope. So thank you so much. You've got, if you can be back in here at 11 o'clock, but please talk to these two in. Yeah, we've said yeah. Okay, so thank you so much. And those of you who are watching on streaming, we're about to go to morning tea. You do the same. However I do this.